Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss about Linux bootloader. This bootloader program is the important component of Linux operating system, which is responsible to boot the Linux operating system. So the Linux bootloader for Rocky Linux is responsible for initiating the operating system startup process. It manages the boot sequence, loads the Linux kernel into memory, and passes control to the kernel to begin the boot process. The bootloader also allows users to select different operating systems or boot options if multiple installations are present. During the installation, you might have seen that the kernel is also getting installed, Linux core component, and if you have multiple kernel versions, because that is the regular practice of updating the kernel whenever it is available in the repository provided by the OEM is nothing but the vendor which provides you all these repositories. And during the booting process, you will see the multiple kernel versions, which gives you option to select which kernel you want to boot from. Okay, that we'll see also. There are certain stages which we are going to discuss in the Linux bootloader. So first of all, we understood that this particular program is responsible for booting the operating system. So the first stage is like primary bootloader stage, the initial stage of the boot process executed by the system's firmware, example BIOS or UEFI, which is again a type of firmware. It locates and loads the secondary bootloader from the boot device. So whenever you do the power on self test, like when you press the power button, usually the BIOS starts and it checks for the hardware or the peripherals attached to your computer, and if any error found, it will print on the screen. So that particular stage is the first stage which executed by the system's firmware. The second stage of the booting process or the bootloader program is secondary bootloader stage, that is grub. So in Linux, Grand Unified Bootloader, which is a very popular program acting as a bootloader program in variety of Linux operating systems. So this stage is managed by grub, which is Grand Unified Bootloader. In most cases, it presents a menu of available kernels and boot options, allowing users to select the desired configuration. So whenever you boot the operating system, it usually gives you the options to select the respective kernel if you want to boot it from. So that is the second stage. We will see that. So I'll just have the walkthrough of how that particular booting happens. The third stage is a kernel stage. So once a kernel and boot configurations are selected, the bootloader loads the Linux kernel into memory and passes control to it to start the operating system. So this is what the third stage belongs to. So when you select the kernel, otherwise on the screen by default it wait for certain seconds like 10 or 5 that you can adjust in grub configuration, and after that it will boot from the kernel which is by default selected or maybe manually selected by the user. That particular stage actually loads a Linux kernel into memory and passes control to it to start the operating system. The bootloader configuration files, including grub's configuration, are typically located in the /boot/grub2. So for example, after installation, you might have access your Linux system, and here on the terminal, I am just going into /boot directory, doing ls-l, and you will see that there are certain directories presented like grub2. So this is the grub bootloader configuration directory, and if you go inside you will see certain files in that, so like grub.cfg or maybe grub environment, etc. Okay, so this is the configuration directory for the grub bootloader. For legacy BIOS systems, as we said, /boot/grub2 or /boot/EFI, this is the directory for the UEFI systems on Rocky Linux. So this is one of the type of firmware, okay, you might see on the latest hardwares, okay. Otherwise the traditional hardware, the old one, legacy hardwares will have the BIOS as a system. Additionally, the bootloader code itself may reside in the master boot record or the EFI system partition ESP depending on the system's firmware type. So master boot record is the location where this particular grub bootloader code is installed. So that location is also referred to as the location of the first sector of your bootable device. For example, you have a hard disk where your operating system is installed. So during the installation, the grub bootloader program is actually installed on the first sector of your hard disk and consume 446 bytes of data from that first sector. So first sector size is around 512 bytes, out of which 446 bytes is consumed by the bootloader program and the 64 bytes of size is consumed by the partition table entry. That is the general theory, or maybe you can say a practice whenever the bootloader program installation happens. So this particular location is called as master boot record, which is first sector of your hard disk where the bootloader program code is installed. So this is how we understood in Linux the grub is a bootloader and which is responsible for initiating the operating system startups. So I have a virtual machine where I can go and just boot it from the so I'll show you that. So this virtual box having the Linux, and you can see here, so the options which we got, like select the kernel, okay. For example, during this is the booting process, and after power on I got the screen, and this particular, just close it. All right, so here we have an option to select the respective kernel. If you have multiple kernel version installed, then you can select the particular one which you want. You can have multiple operating systems also. Grub supports to boot Windows OS also. It means that if you have two operating systems on your computer or on your hard disk, you can have, or grub can also help us to boot the Windows operating system. So you will see the options over here, and then you can select which operating system you want to boot. So you can do the dual boot operating system installation also on this particular system. So here I'm selecting Linux and enter, and you will see that this particular process is nothing but your booting process. So there are certain stages which we are going to discuss in next session, and which will give you the clarity about how the entire booting process is happening and when we finally get the login prompts. All right, so see you in the next session, guys.